Hello, this is Rachel Babin from Oncology News Australia, proud producers of the Oncology Journal Club. This week it's a quick episode in our usual format, full of great papers selected by the team. Hans gets us started with the PRODIGE 7 trial and a comparative study on colorectal cancer mortality in young adults, which interestingly is rising in the USA, Canada and Australia, but not in Europe and Asia. Eva gives us insight into delays with the development of a model to estimate associations between delay in treatment and local tumour control. Eva also sets Craig a homework task on fractals, which you'll hear more about in the coming weeks. We've given Craig Underhill a break from main papers this week after last week's epic episode on ASCO GI, which I highly recommend you listen to if you've not listened already. Our quick bites are a must listen this week. Everyone has something fascinating to share. Where else will you hear about colorectal cancer cells entering a diapause or hibernation-like state? Tweetations and the public disclosure of identifiable patient information? Surveillance mammography for older patients? Why Albury is called Smallbury? An Australian study on late mortality in people with cancer? Saddle sores among female competitive cyclists. Yep, you'll hear it here first on the OJC. We hope you enjoyed today's entertaining and informative episode. As ever, links to all of the papers discussed today are available in the notes. For the latest oncology news and podcast updates, subscribe to the Oncology newsletter for free on oncologynews.com.au. This is Rachel Babin, and this is the Oncology Podcast.
G'day, g'day, g'day. Who can believe it's February 2021? And here I am with my friends Hans Prenen. G'day, Hans.
Hi, Eva. How are you doing?
Good. Have you had your jab yet?
What's a jab?
Injection, vaccination, COVID. Have you heard of that?
Okay. The vaccine. Almost. We are getting vaccinated this month. And I think we will go for the one from Pfizer, but we'll see which one gets to us.
It's a hot topic here in Australia, isn't it? My good friend Craig Underhill.
Yeah. Hi, Eva. Hi, Hans. It does seem to be, and hi, Rachel, it does seem to be the conversation du jour, vaccination, and all the patients saying, should I have my vaccination? And I'm like, well, we don't have it quite yet, so let's wait and see. We need more information, really, don't we? And let's hope it's here soon, and let's hope they work.
Absolutely. Well, I hope you listened to our OJC update with Professor Raina McIntyre, because she answered or gave the most up-to-date information, not always the answer, about the vaccines, but a lot of action going on, a lot of discussion. Set the Twitterverse on fire, as does OJC Podcast. So welcome to any new listeners, hopefully some new trainees, people all over the world. Today we have one of our regular episodes. That means we're going to be discussing a selection of papers that we found interesting that have recently been published. Very soon after this, we will have our ASCO GI update podcast out. That should be out really soon. Got some great special episodes. We've got a disparities episode. We've got women in oncology around the world, global, coming. But for now, Hans, Craig, what have you read? What do you think has made an impact in the last little while? I'll go to you. What was your name? From where?
From Belgium. How many times I have to tell you? I come from Belgium.
Yes. What did you read this week, Hans?
Actually, this month I had a lot of time to read as the weather was so bad, raining every day, snowing some days, didn't see any sun. So I really want to come back to Australia if I can. But I actually selected two papers. The first one is actually a paper I was waiting already for almost 2 years, because it's the final results of the PRODIGE 7 study. As you might remember, it was already presented at the ASCO 2018 about cytoreductive surgery plus HIPEC versus cytoreductive surgery alone. And you know, there's a very big debate about the role of HIPEC. And this was a randomized phase 3 trial performed in France. And they had 130 patients in each group. And actually, the final conclusion was that there was no difference in overall survival between both groups. So no added benefit to HIPEC in combination with cytoreductive surgery. The survival was 41 months in both groups. But I just want to highlight the last years we've been debating a lot about why we should interpret these results with caution. I think a few things are very important to highlight. For example, the technical aspects are very important. So some people argue that the technical details were not perfect in this study. Also, the trial was aimed at improving survival from 30 to 48 months. And I think this is very optimistic. So the trial might be underpowered. Also, they included patients that, in my opinion, should not have been included because 1 out of 4 patients had a PCI over 16. And in my practice, these are not the patients that I would offer cytoreductive surgery plus HIPEC. They claim that they found a difference in overall survival for the ones with PCI between 11 and 15. But again, this is a subgroup analysis, and so it might be biased. So maybe for low PCIs, the HIPEC is not needed. For PCI between 11 and 15, you could do it. I think the conclusion is that this is hypothesis generating, and we have no final conclusions yet on the role of HIPEC in this indication.
Hans, could you explain again to everybody what the PCI is?
Yeah, this is actually an index that the surgeons use to calculate how many peritoneal metastases there are. So they look at the location in the abdomen, they look at the size, and then they calculate some kind of scale. So the lower, of course, the better, the less peritoneal mets, and the smaller they are.
So it's not just about the absolute number, there's a bit more sophistication.
They divide the abdomen in different quadrants, and then they look at size and at number, and then they give it of course, it's a bit subjective as well, but in general, this is very accepted, this PCI index, to give some idea who should receive cytoreductive surgery and who shouldn't.
Really? I thought the outcome was operate for low, operate for intermediate, and try and operate for high. No, it's really a hot topic. It can be remarkable outcomes, but also considerable morbidity. So the debate rages on. Very difficult because our trials don't ever answer these questions, even though they're designed to.
Indeed.
And Eva, do you know if any centres in Australia are doing, or many centres are doing, the hypothermic intraperitoneal chemotherapy? Or is that a European?
No, that Centre of Excellence right in the city that I live in, Melbourne, is a big fan. And I know their interpretation, as I understand it in my discussions, was that from this trial, it was all selection and technical issues, and it hasn't deterred them from continuing to use it. Very happy if a listener wants to ring and prove me wrong, but it's still going ahead. And so that is one of the challenges. The trials are trying to definitively answer these questions, and we end up with more hypothesis generation. They're not easy trials to do and very commendable to do them. But I guess we have problems implementing things like short course radiation with very clear-cut trials. So I guess it's not surprising that trials like this don't necessarily impact on practice, and people dismiss outcomes because of trial-related anomalies.
Fully agree, Eva. So the second paper I selected was published in Gastroenterology end of December 2020, so last year. It's about the colon cancer mortality in young adults, because as you know, we read everywhere that this is rising, this incidence, for example, in the US, Canada, UK, and I think Australia as well. But the paper wants to look at the data, whether this is really true in every country, every region. So what they did is that they extracted numbers of official certified deaths. So it's important, it's the deaths, not the incidence, at age 25 to 49, so young people, when they died from colon cancer. And they looked at from 1980 to 2017. They used the WHO database, and then they selected high-income countries, and very importantly, with more than 20 million inhabitants. So it means Belgium is not amongst them. And then they looked also in the EU as a whole. And what they concluded that there was a rising trend in young adult colon cancer in the USA, Canada, Australia, UK, but not in the other selected countries they had. So, for example, not in Russia, Japan, Germany, EU, etc. So I think this is very important, and that we urgently have to find out what the reason is for this rising incidence in young adults in some countries. And maybe obesity plays a role, maybe something else. So I think it's very interesting data.
Yeah, very vexed issue, young patients. There was an interesting article recently showing that young patients with rectal cancer saw an average of 2 different doctors that were for a misdiagnosis before they were diagnosed. I'll never forget a man in his 30s who came to me, and he actually had the referral to the psychiatrist because he was so fixated on how his bowels wouldn't empty until someone finally found a big rectal cancer. So young patients, fascinating difference though. It doesn't split along east-west sort of traditional diet lines.
No, doesn't seem so.
Not even Belgian fries?
As I said, Belgium was not amongst them, so because we didn't have 20 million inhabitants. But I guess Belgium will fall in the EU figures, I guess.
But you've got 20 million listeners to the podcast, Hans.
That's true.
So, Eva, I was just going to say, like, on the other hand, we saw this rising mortality in young people with colorectal cancer. But the good news is, and we can put the link to this paper, is recently published cancer statistics for 2021 from the American Cancer Society. And overall, there's been an ongoing drop in cancer mortality. And it's largely driven by a reduction in lung cancer mortality, which is great news. And so the thoughts are that that's in parallel with reduction in smoking, but also some substantial improvements in lung cancer treatment. So that's really interesting, and I think we're just on the start of the curve, the impact of IO, and hopefully this will herald some significant improvements in mortality in the years ahead, which is really great news. So we'll put that link up. It's obviously the American population, but many of our listeners are not in the US, but we'll put the link up and people can have a look if they want more detail.
And there's been quite a lot of interest in the recent ASCO meetings, World Lung, etc., about disparities within particularly the American population as well as globally. So watch out for our disparity episode. But did they give any information about the reduction in mortality according to ethnicity or socioeconomic status in that paper?
The paper was actually quite short. It was only a few pages, only 3 pages. So they didn't go that much in detail. But I think it's very hypothesis generating this, and certainly worthwhile to look further in some hypothesis. But Evie, I'm very curious, which papers did you select for this episode?
Well, I selected sort of along a similar theme because for a long time we haven't really had any data on the impact of a delay of diagnosis. So patients will often ask you what would have happened if this was diagnosed a week ago, a month ago, 6 months ago. Obviously, it's a medico-legal question. It's a source of angst for family members if they didn't encourage somebody to get their symptoms investigated. So COVID-19 has given us, with a delay in diagnosis because the health system was fully occupied in some countries like Belgium and UK and US, thankfully not Australia or New Zealand. So we know some of the modelling have shown that breast and colorectal cancer outcomes, we're expecting a 1% total increase in deaths due to delay from COVID in the US. This paper used mathematical modelling, so full of statistics and equations, comes from Weill Cornell in New York and was published in JAMA Oncology recently online. They took 3 cancers with varying doubling times. So head and neck is an example of a rapidly growing tumour. Colorectal cancer is an intermediate. And interestingly, lung is an example of a non-small cell lung as a slow growing cancer. Now, obviously, there's huge variation within these. But into their model, they looked at the literature for the past 20 years and they put in tumour kinetic data. They also put in the tendency to metastasize. And they came up with models for the fast-growing cancer for 2 and 6 month delays. So for the rapid head and neck, a 2-month treatment delay translated into a predicted 5% increase in local tumour control risk and 0.5 increase in new metastases. And at 6 months, that went to a 20% increase in poor local control and 6% increase in new metastases. Now, colorectal as the intermediate cancer was interesting. A 2-month delay was predicted to have a 2% increase in abnormal or poor local tumour control and a 2.7 increase in new metastases. But in their model, a 6-month delay was a 30% approximately increase in local tumour control risk and approximately a 25% increase in new metastases. So here is some data that we can actually quote, or some prediction that we can quote for the impact of treatment delay on tumours. Now, obviously, there are a lot of assumptions. They assume that tumours grow exponentially. We know they actually grow fractally, that they assume that all the whatever size the tumour is, the variables have the same impact, and that doesn't really account for the microenvironment. But an interesting paper and something that we've learnt through the impact of COVID-19.
Fractally. Fractally? What is fractally?
Don't you know what a fractal is?
No, I have no idea what fractally means, actually.
Hans, do you know what a fractal is?
Never heard of.
Oh, okay. That's your homework and you can tell us on the next podcast. Fractals are amazing, absolutely amazing. Anyway, they've replaced the Gomptersian growth theory of cancer cells.
The Wattsian?
Gomptersian. Now, Hans, you know what that is.
Sorry, I don't.
Okay. I need you co-hosts. Anyone out there who knows any super biology want to come on the podcast? We'll talk about it next time. Let's go to quick bites. What have you got for us, Hans?
I selected 2 quick bites, and one is really quite a difficult one, but I still want to explain as I find it fascinating. It's about colorectal cancer cells that go into a diapause-like DTP state, and I will explain what this is, to survive chemo. It's published in Cell in January issue, and it's led by the clinician and scientist Dr. Catherine O'Brien. She's from the Princess Margaret Cancer Center in Toronto. And actually what she looked at is that cancer cells are able to survive chemotherapy and targeted therapy by entering some kind of dormant state. And they call this the DTP state. It's called drug-tolerant persister. Until now, not that special, but they found that during this DTP states that cancer cells go into diapause. And actually, I had to look on Wikipedia what diapause was, because it's actually something in animal dormancy. Diapause is the delay in development in response to recurring periods of adverse environmental conditions. So they showed that by treating tumors with inhibitors of autophagy, so that cancer cells were less likely to enter the DTP state. So what they showed is that cancer cells have adopted an evolutionary conserved mechanism to survive cancer treatment. And I find this quite fascinating, because if you can stop this dormant phase, in theory, you can also kill the cancer cells. But this is, I think, very, very important data.
So is that what happens to animals who go into hibernation? Is that what
indeed
cells
that's
do?
a bit the same, and it's a phenomenon that they don't really know whether it exists in humans or it's used in humans, but in embryological development it exists.
I think Craig's in that phase now, just looking at him.
At the look at his face, I think indeed, yeah. And then the second short paper I selected, and it's a correspondence published in the New England in also January issue. You still remember the data in the New England about sotorasib, which was an inhibitor of the KRAS G12C. It's all around now. And these authors have looked at the distribution of KRAS G12C in more than 30,000 patients with cancers and also across race and sex in 10 cancer types. So the main conclusion in this correspondence letter was that, of course, it's most frequent in lung cancer. It's about 14% of all lung cancer have this KRAS G12C. But also in appendical cancer, colon cancer, small bowel cancer, and each of these tumors, it's around 3%. So it's not frequent, but also not that infrequent. And also strikingly, it was more present in females than in males, and also more in whites and blacks compared with Asians. So I think it's very important data that shows us that some biomarkers might differ depending on race, sex, ethnicity, etc.
And there was a big trial just discussed at World Lung, obviously, with this molecule again.
Yes, indeed.
Excellent. So, Craig, what have you been doing?
I think he's still in diapause.
I've been sitting by the pool, Hans, and chillaxing and reading a little bit of the literature. So I picked a couple of quick bites. The first one was from David Roeder's group in South Australia. The first author was Dr. Kuswara, published in the MJA, Late Mortality in People with Cancer, a population-based Australian study. So it was interesting data. We've had some hints in the past that there's an excess in mortality from cardiovascular-related deaths in people who survive cancer, most particularly in Hodgkin's lymphoma. And this was a really large study with up to 17 years follow-up of people alive after cancer in a group of 32,000 patients in South Australia from the South Australian Cancer Registry data. So that what that showed was an excess in deaths after 5 years, predominantly from cardiovascular causes rather than cancer-related causes. So again, it's more grist to the mill for us considering cardiovascular risk factors and integrating some models of care that take into account cardiovascular risk early on. And I'd refer people, if they want to dive into more detail, to look at episode 17 of the Oncology Journal podcast, which was a cardio-oncology special. And there's quite a lot of information in there. So it's a new field. I think we're going to be hearing more about this. And so this is more evidence of the importance of this consideration. So congratulations to the authors on this paper. And the second one, I'm sorry to mention the C word again. This is COVID-19 as a leading cause of death in the United States from JAMA. The first author was S.H. Wolf. And unfortunately, it's now showing that COVID has become the leading cause of death in the US, exceeding that of cardiovascular deaths and cancer. So if people want to have a bit of a depressing read or an optimistic thank you read, because we're in this bubble in Australia at the moment, have a look at that. It's quite sobering.
Fantastic. Thanks, Craig.
Oh, and Eva. Sorry, Eva, of course.
Oh,
what are your
I
quick
forgot
bites,
she was
Eva?
still here.
What are your quick bites, Eva?
Well, I just have to slip this one in reference to a little problem I had that I shared with you on the podcast a couple of months ago after doing the Victorian Rail Trail bike track. And there's a lot of literature. This one is called Saddle Sores amongst female competitive cyclists.
So, Eva, what's your second paper that you selected as a quick bite?
Well, Hans, you know that we're obsessed with Twitter here on the OJC. And actually, we need to do a followers update. But this was a paper published in the Journal of Medical Internet Research, fantastic journal, called Public Disclosure on Social Media of Identifiable Patient Information by Health Professionals, Content Analysis of Twitter Data. It's got no citations so far, but it's got 176 tweetations. So there you go. We now have to look for tweetations of our papers. But basically, this looked through 656 healthcare professionals, about 3/4 were doctors and the rest were nurses. And it was looking at anyone who shared a story about patient care on Twitter. And what these researchers report is they estimate that family or friends could have identified likely the clinical scenario in about a third of the tweets.
Wow, that's really interesting, because I just recently warned one of our interns who kept tweeting about interesting things that was happening to her at work. And they were so specific. I was like, hang on, it's Smallbury. So I live in the town called Albury, which we call Smallbury because it's only 100,000 people. I was like, I think you need to tone it down a bit, because I reckon people, if they read that, could work out who you're talking about.
I thought it was called Smallbury because you're very short. Yay, 1 to me.
1-0 for Eva.
I'm 5'6", Eva. That's not short. That's tall.
No, but seriously, Craig, this is the interesting perspective. Of course, somebody out there in the world wouldn't guess who it is, but the patient's relatives who know the situation, know the hospital where their family is, they would recognize it. And the paper also identified about 7% of tweets that had actually been deleted, but they can still pick it up in the analytics. So even if you delete your tweet, the data is still there. So a real warning to people about using personal data, and be careful. That was a good paper. Come on.
I think it's just sobering in general. So sometimes I know I'm thinking, I'm pushing it a little bit on the Twitterverse, but, because it's there forever. A lot of pollies have said things that have come back to bite them, things that don't age well. So, we do have to be a little bit mindful that, your mum might read it or your patients might read it. Or
was that a comment about Trump? It comes back to bite him.
Oh, no, sometimes Australian politicians would say something and then they have a contrarian view 2 years later.
No.
Out tweets,
Absolutely. So from now on, we're not only going to ask how many citations you have, but how many tweetations. So I've got 2 other very quick bites. JAMA Oncology Special Communication from Eric Weiner, our new ASCO president, just elected, looking at individualizing surveillance mammography for older patients after treatment for early stage breast cancer. I don't know about you, but these patients seem to be followed forever and for always be having surveillance mammograms. So this paper looks at what is reasonable, when should you stop? Looked at breast cancer survivors 75 years or older. The consensus is if your life expectancy is less than 5 years, even if you had a high-risk cancer, then you should no longer continue surveillance mammography. But if their life expectancy is more than 10 years, it's reasonable. You have to reassure the patient that they'll still have their breasts examined, they'll still be clinically followed up, and if there was a finding, that they would have a diagnostic mammogram. So an interesting paper, and links to my very last quick bite, again a New England Journal publication from the Breast Cancer Association Consortium, looking at breast cancer risk genes, association analysis in more than 113,000 women. So, Craig, why don't they put exactly how many women? Does that mean 113,001 woman? I actually added it up and it was 113,927 women. So I guess the title's not as sexy for the New England Journal. But basically they looked at 34 putative susceptibility genes, 60,000 women with breast cancer and about 53,000 controls. And this is really the landmark paper that will inform genetic clinics on what to search for if they're looking to predict breast cancer risk.
Well, that's a big study, isn't it? They could have said almost 114,000 women.
Yeah, they could. Or they could have just got a few more women. They didn't have many to go, but they ran out.
So while you were talking, I looked up some stats on my Twitter account, Eva. So if you're interested, my top tweet recently, I must admit, I was so excited. So Patricia Carvelis from the ABC Drive program retweeted one of my tweets, and that's now reached 13,000 people. So that was pretty exciting.
13,000?
13,000 people viewed it.
That's more than how many people there are in Belgium. Fantastic. All right. Well, as always, it's been a great pleasure. Thanks to our producers, Rachel and Graham. Thank you, Hans.
You're welcome.
Good luck with the jab.
I learned a few English words today.
Don't get it confused with the snip. If someone offers you the snip, take the jab.
Okay.
Do you know what the snip is?
I guess it's worse than a jab.
More homework for you.
He might want to have a snip.
He might.
How many children do you have, Hans, and do you plan to have any more?
No, I have 2 children, and now I know what you're alluding to.
Yeah.
You think you do. Thank you, Craig. It's been a pleasure. Join us next time for Oncology Journal Club podcast, and tell your friends. Bye.
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 You've been listening to the Oncology Podcast. If you enjoyed today's edition and would like to subscribe, head over to our website, oncologynews.com.au, and sign up to our newsletter. Thanks for listening.